Hi guys, today we're moving on to the fourth poem by Adrienne Rich. So this poem then was written in 1969 and was published in 1971. So that's following, of course, the disintegration of her marriage to Alfred Conrad. So the title of the poem is Our Whole Life. And when we're reading the title, we kind of think, our whole life, does that suggest a kind of collective experience then? And here she's talking about an attempt to communicate ideas, opinions, to describe experiences and feelings, and how difficult sometimes that can be. So essentially, when we boil the themes down to one simple theme, the theme of the poem is communication, or an attempt to engage in meaningful communication. Or if we push it further, then the impossibility of meaningful communication between men and women in particular. Okay, so when we think of different types of communication, obviously we could focus on something like body language or gestures or facial expressions. But then think about it, art itself, so sculpture, painting, dancing, all of that, of course, is a means of expressing oneself. All of that is a means of expressing one's identity as well. So it could be something as simple as we'd say the clothes that you wear, the hairstyle that you have, the jewelry that you wear. So she's focusing on the idea then of the written word, or at least the idea then of verbalizing your experiences and your ideas and trying to describe your feelings. Now, if you think about it, the Austrian philosopher Wittgenstein has a very famous line. He says, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." So the idea is, of course, that if your vocabulary is quite narrow, essentially, quite spare, then that means that you won't be able to fully express what you think and how you feel. And you are going to be inhibited and limited in many different ways, in many walks of life. Think about careers and so on. That would be a very obvious field or a very obvious point to make. Okay, so when we think about our whole life, she's kind of emphasizing a sense of frustration, kind of exasperation as such, that we spend our whole lives trying to communicate who we are and what's important to us. But most of the time, of course, we fumble it or we bungle it, or we just find it a frustrating experience because sometimes, and think about how true this is, sometimes there just isn't the word to express how you're feeling or what you're thinking. Okay, so Wittgenstein had another famous phrase, and he said if we spoke a different language, we would perceive a somewhat different world. So this kind of relates back to the idea of linguistic determinism. Kind of the idea that if you speak, we'd say Portuguese or Russian or Japanese or German, whatever it happens to be as your first language, your experience of the world and your response to the world is going to be completely different. Your perception of the world is going to be completely different to someone who speaks English as a first language. Okay, because the language is very different and the language reflects difference. Obviously, language can reflect, we'd say, different cultures and different backgrounds, different classes, and so on as well. But he's saying fundamentally there is a big difference, essentially, between the languages and how those individual words express different experiences. He also had that particular idea, of course, that if a lion could speak, we would still not be able to understand him because the lion's experience is so very different to our own. So we can see then that the poem, even though it's quite short, deals with a kind of a complicated issue, a complicated theme. Very complex just in terms of how we use language and then how we censor ourselves, perhaps, or how we misuse language, or how sometimes language is just simply inadequate. Okay, so we all have various examples of that in our own lives. So obviously think about the fact that it relates back to Rich in a very personal way in terms of trying to communicate with her husband, for example. And think about it, they ended up estranged, of course, they separated. She, of course, engaged then in a relationship, became involved with a female writer and identified as lesbian. And then her husband, of course, devastated by the breakup of the relationship, ended up taking his own life. So there is that kind of sense there of, trying to explain something to someone who perhaps just doesn't understand. And the idea is that if you don't have that experience, if you don't have those feelings, maybe language just isn't strong or powerful enough to communicate that. So if we think about the opening line then, our whole life a translation. So it's the idea, of course, that we use language then essentially to translate how we are feeling or thinking, just simply to put it into words, and words that are quite common and that anybody could understand or that everybody could understand. Sort of the idea, of course, that language is supposed to be sort of universal. Certain types of languages or certain communications are supposed to be universal. But as we all know, of course, that's just not true. Think about trying to understand somebody who's speaking a foreign language that you're not familiar with. It's just impossible as such. So she is kind of applying that particular idea then to relationships between men and women, because they're coming from two different points of view. They have vastly different experiences. And she's also making the point, of course, if you just kind of narrow it down to your own language or English itself, that language has been created or designed by men for men. So most of the words that we use have actually been coined by men. So she's saying that's a very alienating experience then for women and for female poets, because they're trying to communicate in a foreign language, essentially. Okay, so that's the basic point that she's making here. So if you think about translating, and think about, we say, how difficult it is to constantly translate when you're trying to listen to something, when you're trying to have a conversation. Think of how stilted and fragmented and exasperating an experience it actually is. And even when you think about our whole life, sort of every day, every single experience, then I'm trying to make myself understood. I'm trying to express how I feel and what I think. So she describes it then as the permissible fibs. Now, if you think about a fib, of course, it just is a little white lie. It's kind of an acceptable lie. The little lies, perhaps, that we tell us, or the little lies that are very important in terms of normal social interaction. Okay, even on a very basic level, somebody asking you how you are, and you just simply saying, fine, I'm grand, even though you're not. So we lie all the time. It's kind of social lubrication. It's very, very important, of course, just to get on with people. We censor ourselves all the time. We use euphemisms all the time. We use little idioms then to express how we're feeling, even though they may not pinpoint precisely what we're feeling or exactly what we're thinking. So permissible fibs then, of course, would be those little lies that society allows us to tell, or even society expects us to tell. Okay, so she's kind of emphasizing the idea that maybe if you're lying so much, that maybe you're getting further and further and further away from the truth, that you wouldn't even recognize it if you had to confront the truth as such. Maybe we lie too much to ourselves, to other people, to society, and it's all just a tissue of lies at the end of the day. So she says, and now a knot of lies. Now think about the knot, of course, that would suggest obviously the idea of a tangle of lies then, something, of course, that is very difficult to break through or unravel. So the idea that you have one lie, and then maybe you have to lie to cover that lie. So you tell another lie and another lie and another lie. So it becomes then a knot of lies as such. Think about a knot, something hard and unyielding, something that is intriguing, but also something that's kind of like puzzling, exasperating as well. So it's the idea then, of course, that maybe you become wrapped up so much in the knot of lies that you lose your sense of self. And that could relate back to Adrienne Rich, of course, and her identity as a lesbian as well. So the idea that she's repressed her true self, her true identity for so long that she doesn't even recognize herself at the end of the day. So a knot of lies eating at itself to get undone. And eating, of course, is quite we'd say a sinister verb to use here. It's quite graphic as well, and you could even say that it's quite a violent verb. She uses two key violent verbs later on in the poem, kind of eating at itself. It's almost kind of cannibalizing itself. So eating at itself to get undone is this kind of desperation to get to the truth, to get to the core, to get to the real true person underneath. But maybe that's just impossible. If you've been lying to yourself for so long, you've just lost your sense of self. You've lost essentially your identity, and you don't know how to claw it back. You have no idea how to rescue yourself then as such. And maybe that just applies to language in general, or trying to express yourself, that you're constantly using, we'd say, a very eloquent language, and the more you use that, then maybe the less truthful your expression actually is as well. So here we come to these sort of violent verbs that I was talking about. Words bitten through words, meanings burnt off like paint under the blowtorch. So if you kind of think about it, bitten and burnt here would suggest the idea that meaning is just simply destroyed, that meaning is then lost forever. In a way, we're just kind of mouthing empty words, banalities. We'd say, in a way, it's kind of focusing on the void, essentially, that lies within us if we're not being truthful, if we're not being honest as such. So we're just mouthing or we're just pronouncing these empty sort of platitudes and cliches all the time, rather than actually getting to the nitty-gritty detail, rather than admitting the truth and expressing the truth. Even if it's a brutal truth, it demands to be told. It demands to be written as such then. So words bitten through words. Even notice how she's using the Americanism there as well. And maybe that's kind of reinforcing the idea of an identity as an American poet. Is that important to her? And then meanings burnt off like paint under the blowtorch. So there is an idea here of almost torture or torment as such. Maybe she's emphasizing how difficult it is to be a female poet or a female writer. And if you kind of think about it, we see that even today, where female poets and female writers are vilified sometimes. They're patronized, essentially. They're condemned. A lot of people, we'd say, would be quite ignorant when they're interviewing female novelists, and they emphasize the personal dimension of their writing, or they're quite inquisitive, or they focus too much, we'd say, on what has inspired the novel rather than focusing on the novel itself. You could look at, we say, a modern day example or a recent example would be Sally Rooney, who has written Normal People, which is televised at the moment. And there is a kind of a backlash against her writing, and people saying that it's simplistic, or the characters that she creates, or the themes that she explores, perhaps. They kind of sneer at those and they say, oh, she's just writing, we'd say, highfalutin YA fiction. It's not real. It's not highbrow literature. So in a way then you could say maybe Rich is addressing this particular problem of how female poets have been demeaned. If you go back throughout history, of course, women were not educated. They were not allowed to read and write. So then when women first started to read, obviously, and write, as in write their own novels or compose poetry, they were ridiculed. Okay, so they were largely, of course, kind of figures of fun. They were taunted for doing that, and people didn't take their writing seriously as such. So basically what she's doing then is she is focusing on the notion of communication and how difficult it is, true and meaningful communication as such. All those dead letters rendered into the oppressor's language. Now, if we think about a dead letter is not a dead language. If you think about dead language, relates back to a language that is no longer spoken. Okay, it may have been influential, something like Latin, for example. But a dead letter is just simply a letter that is undelivered. So it was posted, but it was not opened and it was not read. So it's just simply delivered, re-delivered, essentially. So sent back, returned to sender is usually, of course, kind of printed on it or written on it. So if you think about it, what she's saying here is, she is saying, of course, that women throughout history have tried to make themselves understood, try to explain what they're experiencing, what they're going through. But usually men would have sneered and scoffed at it. They would have simply ignored what the woman was trying to say. They wouldn't have tried to understand the female experience as such, whether it be women in general or specifically female poets. Okay, so if we think about it, it's just this correspondence then that is used essentially as a metaphor to represent the female voice, which goes essentially unlistened to. So it's the refusal then of men to accept a woman's point of view or to accept the female experience as such. So we see dead letters then, or a letter, as a metaphor, essentially. Women trying or attempting to communicate their ideas and their experiences and describing their feelings. Then if you think how she's using a simile in the previous couplet, meanings burnt off like paint under the blowtorch. Once more, of course, I said a very harsh, very graphic image here as such. That meaning, of course, is just simply destroyed. And then when we think back to a knot of lies, that's obviously a metaphor as well. Just emphasizing, of course, lie upon lie, kind of layer upon layer then of falsehoods, of lies. And no one, of course, can find the truth. No one can unravel the truth as such there. So all those dead letters rendered, so changed, that's kind of translated, very similar to the very beginning of the poem, into the oppressor's language. And this relates back to the point that I made at the very beginning, that you could say that English, Portuguese, Spanish, whatever it happens to be, is essentially then the language of men. So what is she saying then? She's saying that language needs to change and evolve. It needs to accommodate a female experience. It's not about just kind of shunting the male experience to one side or completely reinventing a language. It's not about that at all. It's about accommodating the language of women and accommodating a female experience. It's very important that language be inclusive, because language is supposed to be for everyone, not just for the elite or not just for the select few as such then too. So she uses examples then, trying to tell the doctor where it hurts. And you're going to think about that's very, very explicit as such, really, because think about it on a very general sense, okay, very general level. You go to the doctor and the doctor asks you, can you rate your pain then? On a scale of 1 to 10, what is the pain like? Would it be a 5? Would it be a 7? Would it be a 10? Okay, and you say, yeah, you can understand where the doctor is coming from there. You can go, yeah, it's definitely an 8. Some days it's a 9. Okay, so that's meaningful communication, and the doctor can work with that as such. But the important point is that the doctor asks the question in the first place, and then that you're able to communicate what your pain actually is like, or how severe it is. So maybe she's talking about women throughout history. Their concerns were largely ignored. Maybe it had something to do, we'd say, with domestic violence, or pregnancy and childbirth, or menstruation, okay, or a miscarriage. Any of the kind of uniquely kind of female experiences that were just brushed under the carpet, or sidelined, or just simply ignored, or trivialized as such. That's really what she's emphasizing there, that it's actually very, very important, and especially, of course, in the past, when doctors were usually male, not female. So therefore the doctor couldn't identify with the patient's experience, or doctors tend to be quite imperious and maybe arrogant or godlike. So she also uses then assimilate, like the Algerian who has walked from his village. Now, if you remember, I did give you a sheet. I sent you a photocopy of a man who had set himself on fire. So that's an example of self-immolation. So it's quite a graphic photograph as such, originally in colour, obviously. So he created kind of a human torch then. And this is the idea of using the human body as a means of protest. So throughout history, we've had plenty of examples where people are driven to such desperate lengths that they will use their own bodies then to protest. Now, if you think about it, you can do it on a very simple level, like wearing a t-shirt with a slogan, protesting something or campaigning for something. That would be a very obvious example, okay? In the photograph then, of course, you have a young man who's 26, 27, and he is protesting then China's interference in Tibet. So he realized, of course, the Chinese are just not listening to him, okay? They're not reading anything. Nobody wants to know when it comes to China's oppression of the Tibetan people. So he decides, as a last resort, he will set himself on fire and everybody will focus on this. And in the photograph, you see, of course, that it's not just the photographer taking the photograph of the man in front of him. Everybody else in the crowd is fixated on that human torch, essentially, on that poor man who has set himself on fire. And there are even people with their cameras taking photographs. So it kind of emphasizes the idea that people will take notice then if you use the body as a means of protest. And it's also a universal language as well. I don't have to speak that guy's language. That guy doesn't even have to verbalize. He doesn't have to open his mouth and say a word. The picture will tell the story. What he has done expresses then his sense of anguish and his sense of desperation. So what she's doing here then is a very similar image. That's why I sent the photograph to you. So basically she says then, it's like the Algerian who has walked from his village. Now remember, of course, that Algeria is a country in North Africa and it was colonized basically by the French. So it's emphasizing the idea, of course, that basically Algeria had to fight for its independence. Okay, so it's reinforcing the notion then that sometimes, obviously as a means of protest, then they resorted to desperate measures, just reinforcing the same point here. So burning his whole body a cloud of pain. So this is the self-immolation then. So think about it. You could relate it back to something like the suffragettes chaining themselves to railings, or the suffragettes, or maybe we say someone like the Irish hunger strikers as well. So starving yourself deliberately to make a point and to protest against some kind of injustice. So she's using this particular example then about how the self-immolation communicates a powerful message of protest. So his whole body a cloud of pain. Notice how she's using a metaphor here again. So a cloud, of course, is an important visual, because think about it. You have the kind of the burning flames, essentially. Think of the roundness of the entire, basically the entire fire then that engulfs the man's body. But also cloud, of course, would suggest that sense of dark oppression or injustice, or a sense of tears, of course, as well. So like a dark cloud hanging over someone, the idea of oppression and injustice, and then the idea of the precipitation or rain falling then as tears. So all of that relates back then to the idea of trying desperately to communicate a particular message. And sometimes, of course, language is inadequate. Sometimes words are just not enough. They're not sufficient. They're not powerful enough. They don't persuade and convince. So she says then towards the end, there are no words for this. And the last line then, that is isolated, except himself. So maybe she's talking about herself there, really. Okay, that she's writing poetry. Is anybody listening? Is anybody reading, though? That maybe she herself, her body then becomes a form of protest. And you kind of think about it, of course, your identity is wrapped up in your physicality, in your physical body, essentially. That, think of the famous sort of feminist mantra from the 1960s, the personal is political. The clothes that you wear can be seen as a political statement. The coffee that you drink is a political statement, if you always buy something like Fair Trade, for example. So the idea then, of course, that she is becoming to recognize her true identity as a woman, as a writer, as an activist, as a lesbian feminist, as such then too. And she can use her body as a form of protest, that it is in a way then stepping away from a heteronormative, we'd say, community or a society, and saying, no, this is my body, I'm kind of reclaiming it, and I'm using it to express who I am and essentially what I am as well. Right, guys. Okay, so it's very important that you would practice writing out, we'd say, a paragraph on the theme of the poem. Go back and have a look at the 3 or 4 pages that I photocopied for you, so you should have that. And also remember, pick out 2 or 3 aspects of style. So the similes and metaphors would be the obvious one there as well. Once more, think of the loose structure. It reminds us then of the poem that we did the last day, From a Survivor. And you could look at something simple like, we say, the lack of punctuation, the run-on lines, the enjambment there, the very specific verbs that she uses, focusing on adjectives, maybe we say kind of allusions or references as well. So anything at all, choose 2 or 3, focus on those, and then just practice writing out a couple of sentences for each one. Okay, talk to you soon.